favor. We don't deserve it. Some have described it as God's riches at Christ's expense. And boy, I'm so thankful for His grace. Are you thankful for His grace? Amen. All right, now look, folks, I'm going to need you to help me out, all right? I keep trying to tell you, preaching is actually a cooperative prospect here. It's okay to respond, amen, by nodding your head or saying amen or whoopee. I mean, just grin. Give me a half grin, something. John chapter 13. John chapter 13. And that is in the Bible, right? Yeah, here we go. John chapter number 13. We've been talking about, pardon me, commitment without limits. You get nothing done, nothing worthwhile if you're not committed. Am I right? We have any former athletes in here? You played school ball or anything like that? Some of you did. Hey, you don't get anywhere if you're not committed, do you? I went over to UMO, me and my wife and Carson, to watch the girls' basketball team scrimmage. And I enjoyed, that's the first girls' game I've ever enjoyed, because all the girls' games I've seen, I mean, if they score in the 20s, it was a high-scoring game. But this game here, I mean, son, they can play. But I didn't only enjoy what I saw, I enjoyed some of what I was hearing. And what I was hearing is not what I was hearing in the gym, in the arena there. It's what I was hearing coming from outside the gym. The baseball team there is in something called circuit training. I mean, that's a lot of fun, isn't it, guys? That's just so fun. And while the girls are playing, I hear these weights a banging, and I hear these guys, I'm thinking, man, they done dropped them on somebody. But I mean, they are getting after it. Now, see, we have 3 of the baseball players here. How many of y'all have already puked during circuit training? Just 1, 2. 2 of the 3, okay? Mac's the only real man in the bunch. And no, I'm kidding. Man, they're in there puking and all. Why in the world would they do that? Commitment. They want to be better. Man, they go after it even when it hurts. They are sacrificing. My wife and I found out the alumni game. Baseball was yesterday, so I said, Dana, come on, let's watch this alumni game. We know some of the alumni. A couple of them teach over here at Southern Wayne. And we were watching, and I heard one of the catchers for the college team. He said to another player, hey, man, I went down for in and outs, squatted down. He's a catcher. He said, and when I squatted down, oh, my, been doing squats. He couldn't hardly move. They were sore. You don't get too far without commitment, folks. Our society is a society that, man, when things get a little tough, we just quit. We got a bunch of young people. I hate watching a sports team give up. Does that grind anybody else's nerves? I mean, look, I don't care if it's football. Last quarter, you're down 72-14. You keep on playing like it's 0-0. But I've seen some teams, they get down by just 1 touchdown or a field goal, and all of a sudden, and you know, hey, game's over now. No commitment. We have no commitment to our marriages. I'm speaking in general here. With a divorce rate of close to 50%, not enough commitment that when we see problems starting to arise and one partner may say, hey, we need to go talk to somebody. Let's go talk to our preacher. Let's go talk to a counselor. We need to talk to somebody. We need to get help. And the other one will say, I don't need any help. Man, let me tell you something. It's better to get counseling than to have to get an attorney, okay? All right? Swallow your pride, but there's no commitment. No commitment. We've talked so far about Christ's commitment to us. How He loved us so much and He was so giving to the prospect of our salvation that He gave His very life for us. sin for us. Man, that's a powerful thought. Let me tell you something. What makes it so powerful, you've heard me say it many times, he didn't die for us because we were good people. He died for us because we were bad. We were sinners. We were lost in our sin, on our way to hell. And He loved us so much. He was so committed to us that He went through the mocking, He went through the beating, the scourging, had His beard plucked, crown of thorns on His head, body laid open, He nailed to a cross. He went through all that to get to the point where He would say, okay, the sins of the world are on me now. It is finished. And He'd give up the ghost. Man, what commitment. And let me point out to you, you know who we're talking about, right? The Son of God, God in the flesh. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and take Him off that cross. He could have done that. But He was committed to us. We talked about how are we committed to Him without limits, like He was committed to us without limits. We talked about, are we committed to His mission? That mission to spread the gospel. Are we committed without limits? Spoke last week, I mentioned last week about that missionary. I don't have his name written down. It was hard enough for me to pronounce when I did have it. But he's a missionary to the Hawaiian island. Boy, that sounds just wonderful, doesn't it? Of Molokai. Molokai is where they put all the lepers, those with leprosy. And he ended up eventually dying with leprosy, and his country said, hey, we want his body back. We're going to bury his body here in our country. And the people of Molokai said, okay, then could you just cut off his hands and let us bury his hands here? Because he is the only one who would take his hands and touch us. Gave himself totally for the mission of the gospel, well, without limits. Talked about being committed without limits to our marriage. Let me tell you something, folks. Marriage is supposed to be a wonderful, wonderful thing. It is actually supposed to be a picture of our relationship with God and His relationship with us. It's supposed to be a wonderful thing. It's supposed to be a thing that strengthens us, that encourages us, that makes us better. That's a source of peace, a source of joy, a source of comfort. But we're humans, aren't we? Look, when my wife and I got married, God took an imperfect man and put him with an imperfect woman, and you know what He made? An imperfect home. Imperfect. But we're supposed to be committed to making that relationship what it's supposed to be. Talked about being committed to serve. So what does all this even look like, preacher? I know, and look, it's one thing to say, I'm committed. And I know some of you have often said our preacher needs to be committed. Wrong kind of committed. It's easy to say, yeah, I'm committed. But what does that even look like? Look in John chapter 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that His hour was come, that He should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved His own which were in the world. Now, listen to these 6 words. He loved them unto the end. Total commitment. Look, He knew what was ahead. He knew that His hour was come, the Bible said. When He knew His hour was come, He knew that there was going to be false witness raised against Him. He knew there was going to be lies told about Him. He knew that those that had traveled with Him and He had slept under the stars around a fire with these guys and they had eaten together, He knew that they were going to totally abandon Him. He knew of the beating that was coming ahead. How He'd be beaten with that cat of 9 tails, His body laid open. He knew of the crucifixion, how He would be nailed to the cross. He knew that this was the time, that the very next day, he was going to bear the sin of all mankind through all history. He knew it. And yet he continued to love his own. There was very much in his followers, and by the way, let me submit, there's very much in his followers today that was fitted to check and to kill his love, the love of Jesus for his followers. As we read the New Testament, we find that those followers of Christ were not a whole lot different from us today. He said that, man, fellas, you're slow of understanding. How many of you have ever helped your children with homework? How many of you have helped your children with your homework, but you really didn't know what in the world they were doing? Anybody ever done that? But how many of you ever experienced this here? Where you know what you're doing, you know how to do it, and you're trying to help them, but they're just not getting it. Has that ever happened with you? I remember when I was back in Charlotte, in our church, we had a school, and I was teaching. One of the classes I taught, one of the subjects was math. And there's this one fella, man, he just struggled with math. I was teaching Algebra 1. And we sat down at a table. I took him to a separate room. I had another teacher come cover my class, and I sat down with him, and I would try to help him, and I'd say, okay, now what do we do here? And finally, I thought, he's starting to get it. And I would say, okay, what do we do here? What's the next step? And he would tell me, and I'd say, that is right. And I'd write it down for him and say, okay, now, what is the next step? And he'd tell me. I was like, oh, this is starting to be good. And we got down to the last step, and it was something, I'm going to exaggerate how easy it was, but it was pretty easy. He should be able to do it in his head. It came out to something like 3 plus 3. And I said, okay, now, what is that? 3 plus 3, 27? And I looked at him, and he looked at me. And we both just busted out laughing. I said, man, I don't know what to do. I remember teaching my son, Chad, to spell words. And I remember, I want to say the word was cat. He was learning phonetics, how to sound things out. And so it wasn't spell. I was teaching him to read. I was helping him learn to read. And he got to that word cat, and he said, what's that? And I said, you sound it out. What does C say? Yeah, that's it. That's right. What does the A say? Ah, good job. Yeah, you got it. And he said, ah. I said, so put those together. What is C-A? He said, ka. I said, oh, man, this is good. That's right. You're doing it. I said, this is the letter T. What does T say? And he thought for a minute. He said, t. A bunch of the kids are doing it with me, and adults. He said, t. I said, okay, man, put it all together. Put it together. And he said, frog? You can't make that up. And I said, what? He told his disciples, he said, you're slow of understanding. He would tell them things like, I've not come to be ministered to, but to minister. And then they would say, as he is going through Samaria, and the Samaritans wouldn't let him stay there, they would come and say, hey, Jesus, you want us to call down fire and have them burned? He said, what are you doing? I didn't come to destroy life, but to save it. He said, you're slow of understanding. They were slow to comprehend his nature, slow to appreciate his mission. They were unworthy of his companionship and his fellowship. They were inconsistent. They would say, Peter said, I'll never leave you. Though they kill me, I'm not going to leave you. Everybody else may, but I'm not going to leave you. Yet at his most critical hour, Peter ran. Let me ask this question. Could we bear from one another what daily he bears from us? Yet this glorious friend and brother loves us, though we treat him thus. Though for good we render ill, he accounts us brethren still. He loves us in spite of us. In spite of our faults, He continues to love us without limits. He continues to be committed to us without limit. Let me ask you something. If people treated you the way you treat Jesus Christ, Brother Phil, let me ask you something. If people treated you, let's say your wife treats you the way that you treat Jesus Christ, what would you, no, never mind. I don't, how would you feel about that? I mean, man, we neglect Him, don't we? We neglect to pray like we ought to. We neglect to read His Word. We neglect to stand up for Him. We neglect to tell others about Him. Yet He's committed to us without limits. Romans 5:8, but God commendeth His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. 1 Timothy 1:15, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief, Paul said. Never in the Word of God do we find Christ placing a limit on His commitment to us. Never. Not one place. You won't find it. Not one place did He say, Peter, that's enough. I've had it with you, man. Just go on about your business. No, He said, Peter, well, Satan's desired to tear you apart, man. He's desired to sift you as wheat. Peter, I've prayed for you. Commitment without limits. So what does that look like in our lives, folks? It's one thing to say, I'm committed to Christ. It's one thing to say, oh, yeah, I'm committed to my marriage. But what does that look like in our life? Well, Ephesians 5:25, it looks like the husband loving his wife as Christ loved the church with no limits. Love the husband loving the wife despite any faults there may be there, despite what her past may be, despite her unworthiness, despite maybe her selfishness, despite her inconsistency, or anything else that may be negative in that wife. It is this commitment without a limits, a commitment to my marriage. It's loving my wife regardless, like Christ loved the church. I mean, man, when I have to wake up at 2 in the morning because she's snoring, it sounds like a diesel truck next to me. Hey! No, I'm teasing. She doesn't snore. Just once in a great while. She didn't even hardly smile. I need help. Nah. Without limits. It looks like the wife loving and reverencing her husband despite his past, despite his poor decisions, despite maybe his selfishness, his inconsistency, despite his unworthiness. Listen to this. Stephen Kendrick from the Love Dare wrote this. Nobody knows you as well as your spouse, and that means no one will be quicker to recognize a change when you deliberately start sacrificing your wants and wishes to make sure his or her needs are met. That's what it looks like to be committed without limits. Every now and again, I just sit down and I'll think about my wife. I'll think about all the positives, and there's more than I could even have time to list. Boy, and I thank God for her. Then sometimes I'll think in my mind, now what could be the worst? I married her for better or for worse. What does that mean? What is that worse? Because I also said at the end of that, till death do us part, even in the middle of the worst. What does that look like? And in my mind, I'll run through what to me the worst would look like. And I can't do it for long because it's just stomach wrenching. I'll say, now, God, help me to love her even if that ever happened. Help me to love her without limits. What does it look like in my life to be committed without limits? It looks like the employee serving the employer as if in service to God. We find that in Ephesians chapter 6. It looks like the employer looking out for the best interest of the employee rather than himself. It looks like the Good Samaritan stopping on the road to help the wounded Jew who, if roles had been reversed, the Jew most likely would not have helped the Samaritan. It looks like the lady publicly suffering whatever humiliation, but washing the feet of Jesus Christ. It looks like Paul, the apostle, suffering gladly for the sake of Christ. It looks like Stephen being faithful even unto death as he was being stoned to death. It looks like the disciples rejoicing over suffering persecution. It looks like the church of Macedonia giving beyond their power to meet the needs of others. It looks like Jesus feeding the hungry. It looks like Paul taking the gospel throughout the known world. It looks like Onesimus, the slave who had run away, going back to his master Philemon and submitting himself to him. And it looks like Philemon receiving Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a brother. It looks like the father receiving the prodigal son back home mercifully. It looks like David faithfully praying, even though it would end him up in the lion's den. It looks like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing for God and remaining faithful to God, even though it would end them up in the fiery furnace. It looks like Christ giving himself for all mankind. It looks nothing at all like self. What does it mean, this commitment without limits? Commitment to God, commitment to His mission, commitment to my family, commitment to all these things that the Bible talks about. What does that even look like? Okay, let me explain it better this way. It doesn't look anything at all about being absorbed with ourselves. Tell me where you find in the Bible where Jesus was thinking about Him and only Him. Show me. You won't. This commitment is death to self. Proverbs 20 or 27:20. Let me say to you, selfishness can never be satisfied. Never. It just creates more appetite. Proverbs 27:20 says, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. How many of you have looked for something and you thought, man, I'm saving my money. If I could just have that, that would be the one right there. And that car, that house, that gun, that rod and reel, whatever. If I just had that, I'd be satisfied. And then you got it, and then a year later, you want another one. That ever happened to anybody? Not that you want to admit. Oh, if I had that piece of jewelry. Oh, if I just had that dress. That better be a lady saying that. If I just had those cowboy boots. If I just had whatever. And then we get it. Man, I'm satisfied. I don't need anything else. Then a year later, boy, we're wanting some more. Selfishness can never be satisfied. It leads to a life of sadness and depression. It leads to a lack of fulfillment. This selfishness, this obsession with self, and boy, All you got to do is get on Facebook for about 5 minutes and see how obsessed with self people are. I mean, hey, look, there's people. I don't understand these girls. They get their phone, they hold it up at some weird angle, and they do their face like this. And they take the picture, and they put all these pictures all over Facebook of themselves, making funny faces, thinking it looks good. Why? Obsessed with self. Obsessed with self. We put, I'm checking in. Here's where I'm eating. Who cares where you're eating? Unless you have invited me, then I care where you're eating. I'm at Food Lion. What? Why do you? Who cares if you're? I don't mean who cares like we don't care about you, but what an obsession! Are we not obsessed with self? We put videos on, not of our children or our dog or our cat. Why'd somebody want to do that? I don't know. And unless it's through the crosshairs. No, I'm teasing. Just teasing. Just kidding. I like cats. They taste like chicken. A little soy sauce. Just kidding, sister. Don't hurt me. We put videos of ourself. We're so stinking obsessed with ourself. That obsession, it leads to anger. That selfishness, it leads to loneliness. If you live your life for you alone, then at the end of your life, that is all you're going to have. If all you're living for is you, and that's your number one commitment, I want to scratch my itch. I want to do what I want to do. I want to be pleased. I want people to treat me right. We get mad over the silliest things, don't we? We get mad over something somebody else is doing that doesn't involve us. It doesn't involve anybody we know. But boy, we'll get mad. Why? Because I don't like it. That's why. It leads to loneliness. It leads to hurting others. Look what it did to King Saul. In his jealousy. Now, he's the king. He is the man. God chose him. He has God's favor. David kills a giant that, by the way, Saul was too scared to go out and kill himself. And after the battle, they're riding through town, and the girls are singing, "Oh, Saul hath slain his thousands." Now, really, he did it by proxy. Everybody else slew him for him. He was back there watching. Saul has slain his thousands. Boy, he thought, yeah, that's right. And David, his tens of thousands. David, that we know of at that battle, had only killed one. Now, he was a significant figure. He is a giant of a man. But he had killed that one. And they're singing, David has killed his tens of thousands. Now, what they were doing, they were giving David credit for something he had done. To some extent, they were giving Saul credit when he hadn't done a thing, and he was angry. So much so that the Bible says he began to eye David and sought to kill him. That became an obsession of Saul. I've got to kill David. I've got to kill David. It was all about him. His whole life became one wrapped up in his own self, and God eventually chose someone to replace him. This life I'm talking about, commitment without limits, here's what it looks like. It is a self-denying life. Listen, in your marriage, sir, just forget totally about pleasing yourself and please your wife. And wife, forget totally about pleasing yourself and you please that husband. And if you're both living selflessly like Christ, man, I wonder what in the world that would do for our relationship. It's self-denying. It's self-effacing, self-sacrificing, self-forgetting. There's a poem that goes like this. Lord, help me live from day to day in such a self-forgetful way that even when I kneel to pray, my prayers shall be for others. Help me in all the work I do to ever be sincere and true, and know that all I do for you must needs be done for others. When my work on earth is done and my new work in heaven's begun, may I forget the crown I've won while still thinking of others. Others, Lord, yes, others, let this my motto be. Help me to live for others that I may live like thee. We can say, I'm committed to Christ. I'm committed to my family. I'm committed to the mission. But if there's still an ounce of selfishness in there, there's some limits in there. Committed without limits. A man named Louis Giglio said this: but to mean it when I say that I want my life to count for His glory is to drive a stake through the heart of self, a painful and determined dying to me that must be a part of every day I live. Paul said it in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said these three words: I die daily. That's what it looks like. Hey, students, that means even if your teacher can tend to be a jerk, you treat them with respect and you get the work done. And teachers, that means even if you have a class of morons, you love them and you don't give up on them. You pray for them. And ma'am and sir, in your marriage, you took those vows for better or for worse. That means even if worse comes, you don't throw in the towel. You do it like Christ would. You don't give up. Is your marriage struggling? Then let me just encourage you. Get self out of the equation. Live for your spouse. Commitment without limits. Is your relationship, your spiritual relationship with Christ struggling? I just don't know. It's not what it needs to be. Then look, get self out of the picture. Surrender to Him. Commitment without limits. Workplace relationships, school place relationships, neighborhood, and there's something wrong, then listen, let me encourage you. Get self out of the equation. We talked about being committed to growth, spiritual growth, commitment without limits. Look, you'll not grow if there's a root of self still in there, choking out the Word of God. Will you let self be crucified? Will you live for Christ and for others without limits? Bow your head and close your eyes, please.